Hello, my name is Sophia Mannion Boylson, and welcome to Disastrophie. Here I discuss disasters, true crime, what have you, all while I create a piece of art. Today's episode will probably be a bit longer than usual because the content is extremely heavy and complex. It's been 21 years since 4 planes were hijacked by 19 terrorists and flown into determined targets. Today I will be discussing September 11th, 2001. As previously stated, this event was a series of 4 suicide terrorist attacks carried out by the extremist terrorist group Al-Qaeda. The 19 hijackers were split into 3 groups of 5 and 1 group of 4. Each group took control of 4 planes with the goal of crashing them into prominent US buildings. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers, 1 plane hit the Pentagon, and 1 crashed into a field outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Overall, there were 2,977 victims. I don't count the 19 hijackers towards that number, simply because it was their intent to kill and die. They weren't victims. They were the perpetrators. So I'm choosing to deliberately omit them from the victim count. This event kick-started the War on Terror and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. The original World Trade Center was a complex of 7 buildings in the financial district of Lower Manhattan, New York City. The complex was opened April 4th, 1973, and stood until the attacks of September 11th, 2001. At the time of their completion, the Twin Towers, the North Tower at 1,368 feet, and the South Tower at 1,362 feet, were the tallest buildings in the world. The other buildings in the World Trade Center complex include the Marriott World Trade Center, 4 World Trade Center, 5 World Trade Center, 6 World Trade Center, and 7 World Trade Center. The complex was designed by Minoru Yamasaki to symbolize the globalization and economic power of America. He was inspired, kind of ironically, by Islamic architecture, and an interesting side note, Yamasaki was actually afraid of heights. Even before September 11th, the World Trade Center experienced several major crime and terrorist incidents. There was a fire on February 13th, 1975, the infamous bombing of February 26, 1993, and a bank robbery on January 14, 1998. The Pentagon was, and still is, the headquarters building of the U.S. Department of Defense. It is located in Arlington County, Virginia, and designed by George Bergstrom. The construction of the Pentagon began on September 11, 1941. It was the 60th anniversary of breaking ground that day. It was completed January 15, 1943. At the time of the attacks, the Pentagon was undergoing renovations, so many officers that normally would have been occupied were empty. The area the plane hit was actually the only area best prepared for an attack. It was the only area with a sprinkler system. It had been reconstructed with a web of steel columns and bars for bomb blasts. Its steel structure was bolted together to form a continuous structure, and it had 2-inch thick, blast-resistant windows that stayed intact through the impact and fire. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 with 92 aboard, took off from Boston Logan International Airport, bound for Los Angeles. The flight was captained by Captain John Ogonowski and First Officer Thomas McGinnis Jr. Members of the flight crew included purser Karen Martin and flight attendants Barbara Arestigui, Jeffrey Coleman, Sarah Lau, Kathleen Nicosia, Betty Ong, John Roger, Diane Snyder, and Amy Sweeney. The hijacking began roughly around 8:14 when the pilots stopped responding to the Boston ARTCC. It is believed they took force using box cutters and the threat of a bomb. Whether the bomb was real or fake remains up for debate, but it was most likely fake. At 8:16, the aircraft leveled off at around 29,000 feet and began to deviate from its scheduled flight path. A minute later, flight controllers heard a brief, unknown sound that could have been a scream on the flight's radio frequency. Flight controllers tried and failed to contact Flight 11 at 8:23 and 8:25. Reports from flight attendants Amy Sweeney and Betty Ong, who contacted American Airlines during the hijacking, said the hijackers stabbed flight attendants Karen Martin and Barbara Arestigui and slashed the throat of passenger Daniel Lewin. It is currently unknown exactly how the hijackers gained access to the cockpit. Once the hijackers got into the cockpit, loud arguing could be heard. The hijackers either killed or incapacitated Captain Ogonowski and First Officer McGinnis. Sweeney reported Martin was badly injured and being given oxygen. Both Sweeney and Ong said that Arestigui's injuries were not as serious. One of the hijackers showed Sweeney a device with red and yellow wires that appeared to be a bomb. The coach passengers in the back didn't seem to fully understand the situation, probably under the impression it was a routine medical emergency at the front of the plane. It's possible that at first, most didn't know that it was a hijacking. Ong reported Daniel Lewin appeared to be dead. One of the terrorists that sat directly behind him had attacked him. There are two scenarios to explain what happened to Lewin. The first is Lewin could have been attacked unprovoked to frighten the passengers and crew. The second is that Lewin was an American-Israeli internet entrepreneur who understood Arabic. He may have attempted to confront a hijacker ahead of him, unaware of the one behind him. Lewin is believed to be one of the first fatalities of the September 11th attacks. Both Ong and Sweeney provided information about lack of communication with the cockpit and the spraying of mace in the business class cabin. They also provided seat locations of the hijackers, which helped identify them later. Twice, one of the hijackers transmitted their voice to Boston ARTCC. Once at 8:24. "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourselves and the airplane. Just stay quiet." It's assumed the hijacker attempted to make the announcement to the passengers, but instead accidentally keyed the wrong switch, and it was broadcasted outside. At 8:26, the plane turned south. At 8:33, a second accidental transmission was received. "Nobody move, please. We are going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves." At 8:37, the pilots of Flight 175, who were minutes away from being hijacked themselves, confirmed Flight 11's location and heading to flight control. At 8:46, the airplane is deliberately crashed into the northern facade of the North Tower of the World Trade Center between floors 93 and 99. It impacted the tower at about 404 knots, about 465 miles per hour, 208 meters per second, 748 kilometers per hour, carrying about 10,000 US gallons of jet fuel, 58,000 liters, 8,300 imperial gallons. Flight 175 was captained by Victor Saracini and First Officer Michael Horrocks. It's believed that the flight was hijacked between 8:42 and 8:47. Most likely, the hijackers forcibly entered the cockpit using knives to stab the flight crew and kill both pilots. The first operational evidence that Flight 175 was experiencing anything wrong was when the transponder signal changed twice within 60 seconds. But it wasn't noticed until 8:51 when the plane also changed altitude. Aircraft controllers worked for over 3 minutes unsuccessfully trying to contact the flight. Instead, they worked to move aircraft out of the way. Flight attendant Robert Fangman and passenger Brian David Sweeney made phone calls from the rear of the aircraft. At 8:52, Fangman reported the hijacking and said that the hijackers were probably flying the plane. He said both pilots were dead and a fellow attendant had been stabbed. After 1 minute and 15 seconds, the call was disconnected. Brian David Sweeney first attempted to call his wife at 8:59. He ended up having to leave a message telling her about the hijacking. Then he called his parents and spoke with his mother. He mentioned the passengers were considering storming the cockpit, but he thought that the hijackers might come back, so he quickly hung up. At 8:52, Peter Hansen dialed his father, telling him of the hijacking. Hansen was traveling with his wife and their 2-year-old daughter. That 2-year-old child, Christine, was the youngest victim of the attacks. Hansen said the hijackers had commandeered the cockpit and stabbed a flight attendant. He also mentioned the plane was flying erratically. He made a second phone call at 9 o'clock. "It's getting bad, Dad. A stewardess was stabbed. They seem to have knives and mace. They said they have a bomb. It's getting very bad on the plane. Passengers are throwing up and getting sick. The plane is making jerky movements. I don't think the pilot is flying the plane. I think we are going down. I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast." The call abruptly cut off with Hansen's father hearing a woman screaming. At 9:03, Flight 175 crashed nose first into the southern facade of the South Tower at over 500 miles per hour, 800 kilometers per hour, 200 meters per second, or 430 knots, striking floors 77 through 85. Approximately 9,100 U.S. gallons, 34,000 liters, or 7,600 imperial gallons of fuel ignited on impact. Flight 77 was captained by Charles Burlingame and First Officer David Charles Boy. The flight was hijacked between 8:51 and 8:54. The last normal communication between the crew and air traffic controllers was at 8:50. Unlike the previous 2 flights, there were no reports of anyone being stabbed or bomb threats. The pilots were possibly herded to the back along with the rest of the passengers. At 8:54, the plane began to deviate from its normal flight and turned south. At 8:56, the transponder was turned off. The autopilot was set towards Washington, D.C. At this time, Flight 11 had already crashed into the North Tower. Flight 175 was known to be hijacked and minutes away from hitting the South Tower. American Airlines announced a nationwide ground stop for its planes. 2 people on Flight 77 made phone calls to the ground. At 9:12, Renee May called her mother in Vegas. In the 2-minute call, she claimed wrongly that 6 men had forced them into the back of the plane. She didn't explain who they were, but most likely both crew and passengers. Between 9:16 and 9:26, Barbara Olson called her husband, United States Solicitor General Theodore Olson. She reported to him that the airplane was hijacked with box cutters and knives. She told him that everyone, including the pilots, were in the back. The call cut off, but 5 minutes later, she called back and asked what she should tell the pilot to do. Olson asked her location. she reported flying low over a residential area. He informed her of the World Trade Center attacks, to which she was quiet. The two expressed feelings of love and reassurance before the call cut off again. Autopilot was disengaged at 9:29. As Flight 77 was 5 miles away west-southwest of the Pentagon, it made a 330-degree spiral turn clockwise, descending 22,200 feet, pointed towards its target. Seconds from impact, the right wing clipped some lamp posts and a portable generator. Flight 77 hit the western side of the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour, 850 kilometers per hour, 240 meters per second, 460 knots. Flight 93 was captained by Jason Dahl and First Officer Leroy Homer, Jr. By the time Flight 93 had taken off, Flight 11 was 4 minutes away from hitting the North Tower, Flight 175 was being hijacked, and 77 was climbing normally 9 minutes away from being hijacked. At 9:19, a United Flight dispatcher began sending text cockpit warnings about the other incidents. The last normal communication from the crew occurred around 9:27. The hijacking began at 9:28, with the plane diving dramatically about 680 feet in 30 seconds. The aircraft made communication to Cleveland controllers and other pilots nearby, containing what was later described as unintelligible sounds of possible screaming and a struggle. 35 seconds later, the aircraft made another transition. In both calls, a man could be shouting, "Mayday, Mayday, get out of here, get out of here." Homer's wife later identified his voice on the recording. Eventually, the flight stabilized from its sudden drop. Out of the 4 planes, Flight 93 was the only flight able to get out a distress call. The pilots most likely keyed the microphone so the struggle could be overheard by ATC. It wasn't just a call for help, but also a warning. Like Flight 11, the hijackers accidentally broadcasted instructions meant for the passengers. It recorded one of the hijackers announcing they have a bomb on board and for everyone to stay calm. It is believed that a heavily injured Captain Dahl took certain actions to interfere with the hijackers, possibly disengaging the autopilot and rerouting frequencies to ATC instead of the passengers. The passengers and crew started to make phone calls starting around 9:30. In total, there were 35 air phone calls and 2 cell phone calls. 10 passengers and 10 crew members provided information to family, friends, and others. Tom Burnett made several phone calls to his wife, explaining the plane had been hijacked. A passenger had been stabbed, and he suspected the bomb was a ruse. The passenger that had been stabbed was dead. This is believed to have been Mark Rothenberg. Like Daniel Lewin on Flight 11, it's possible he was either attacked unprovoked or confronted the hijackers and was killed. Burnett's wife told him about the World Trade Center attacks. He began asking for information of the attacks and began relaying the facts to his fellow passengers. His last message to his wife was, "Don't worry, we're going to do something." Flight attendant Sarah Bradshaw called maintenance at 9:35, reporting the hijackings. Mark Bingham called his mother at 9:37. Jeremy Glick called his wife at the same time, remaining connected until the end of the flight, when he reported the passengers were voting on whether to rush the hijackers. Joseph DeLuca called his father at 9:43. Linda Gronlund called her sister at 9:46. Cece Lyles called her husband at 9:47. Marion Britton called her friend at 9:49. Sarah Bradshaw, after calling maintenance, called her husband at 9:50. Honor Elizabeth Wyneo called her stepmother at 9:53. She was on the line for 4.5 minutes, concluding her call with, "I have to go. They're breaking into the cockpit. I love you." Sarah Bradshaw entered her own call with "Everyone is running up to first class. I've got to go. Bye." Todd Beamer had attempted to call his wife, but was routed to GTE phone operator Lisa D. Jefferson. Beamer told her that he and a few passengers were planning to jump the hijacker with the bomb. He recited the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm with Jefferson and other passengers. The 23rd Psalm is the "I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil" quote. He requested that if he didn't make it, that Jefferson call his family and let them know how much he loved them. The last words heard from outside of the plane were, "Are you ready? Okay, let's roll." The passenger revolt began at 9:47. As passengers began to force their way into the cockpit, the hijackers began to roll the plane left and right to try to knock the passengers off balance. Then they tried angling the plane up and down. Ultimately, the plane began semi-stabilizing around 10 o'clock. At that time, the passengers used the food court as a battering ram against the cockpit door. A few seconds later, the hijackers and passengers could be heard shouting along with glass breaking. At 10:03 near Indian Lake in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the plane crashed into a field next to reclaimed coal strip mine. The flight had about 5,500 to 7,000 gallons of fuel remaining, which ignited as the plane impacted at 563 miles per hour, 489 knots, 252 meters per second, 906 kilometers per hour. It hit the ground at a 40-degree nose-down inverted altitude, leaving a crater about 8 to 10 feet deep and 30 to 50 feet wide. It is believed that the intended target of Flight 93 was either the White House or the Capitol. I am choosing to focus on about 4 or 5 stories of survival from the Twin Towers, mostly so this whole episode isn't just depressing. The first story is of Mac Hanna, an Egyptian immigrant who, along with Frank DeMartini and Pablo Ortiz, was a part of a group of 5 that saved 50 to 77 lives in the North Tower. He worked on the 88th floor of the North Tower. Hanna was on the west side when he heard the impact of Flight 11, but at the time he didn't realize it was a plane. He thought there might have been a problem with the water pipes. His friend and co-worker Frank DeMartini had survived the 1993 bombing and warned him of the dangers of smoke. They left the 88th floor to find a stairwell. They found a path and began clearing debris for the about 24 to 39 88th floor colleagues that followed them. Then they heard banging from the 89th floor. They decided to go up to see if they could help. On the 89th floor, they found a trapped group. They used a crowbar to force open the jammed door and got most of them out. When Hanna looked in through the doorway, he saw that the 89th floor was on fire. He and the 4 others with him saved 23 lives on that floor alone. They moved to the sky lobby on the 78th floor, where they found another group of people trapped in an elevator. They were able to break open that particular elevator, but they were unable to save a friend of theirs that was in a different elevator. DeMartini and Ortiz stayed behind, while Hanna guided an 89-year-old man, Mo, down to the ground floor. Down on the 21st floor, he met a group of firefighters, but he kept thinking of his best friends above. On the 10th floor, he heard a loud bang, followed by a loss of the emergency lights. It was 9:59 a.m., and the South Tower had just collapsed. Hanna and Mo made it out, but unfortunately, DeMartini and Ortiz did not make it. The next story is that of Ron Clifford. That day, he was supposed to meet an appointment at the Marriott Times Square, but it was changed to the Marriott World Trade Center. The appointment was to close a major deal for his company over breakfast. His sister, Ruth McCourt, had suggested that he wear a suit that would stand out. Following her advice, he wore a dark blue suit, a white shirt, yellow tie, and a matching hanky in his breast pocket. He arrived at 8:30. The meeting began at 9, so he was early enough that he could walk down the marble hallway from the Marriott to the World Trade Center lobby. Clifford was just heading out the revolving doors when Flight 11 hit the North Tower. Like many who didn't witness the crash, he originally thought it was a tank rupture in the basement. He felt the building begin to shake with secondary explosions. As he made his way towards the connecting doors with the Marriott Hotel, he saw a woman who was badly burned stumbling towards him. Her arms were held out in front of her, being so swollen and burned she couldn't have them at her sides, and her head was bare of any hair. The woman, Jenny Ann Maffeo, had been waiting outside for a bus when the plane hit. She had gone to try and run inside when a fireball engulfed her. Clifford told her to sit down. He went and grabbed a plastic bag to fill with water to douse her with, all the while shouting for EMS. Together, they said a Hail Mary and then the Lord's Prayer. That's when they heard the second explosion of Flight 175 hitting the South Tower. On that plane were two people connected to Clifford. His sister, Ruth, and her daughter, his niece, Juliana. A nurse came over to give Jenny Ann some oxygen and swabs. Clifford put a tablecloth over her and guided her to the exit. As they entered the street, a white-helmeted fireman told them to run, to get the hell out of there. They ran across the West Side Highway and got Jenny Ann into an ambulance. In the aftermath, all Clifford wanted to do was go home and go back to his normal life. But then he got the fateful call from his brother-in-law, David, asking if he knew who Ruth was. That was when it was revealed to him that his sister and niece were on Flight 175. Unfortunately, despite Clifford's efforts and the efforts of everyone around her, Jenny Ann Maffeo would pass away from her burns 41 days later. Our next story involves two more people brought together by fate, Brian Clark and Stanley Premnath. Stanley Premnath worked on the 81st floor of the South Tower. After the first plane hit, he originally went to evacuate the building, but security told him and his group to go back up, since their building was secure and safe. So, listening to authority, he did. He was back at his desk when he saw Flight 175 fly past the Statue of Liberty, getting larger and larger as it came towards him. When he realized that it was aiming for his building, he dove underneath his desk. The nose of the airplane hit 130 feet away from him. That desk was the only one that stood firm, while everything else around it was flattened. A large chunk of the plane was blocking the office doorway. Determined to see his family again, he crawled across the entire floor until only a sheetrock wall prevented him from leaving the floor. Here we'll leave Stanley's story and briefly get into Brian Clark's. Clark worked on the 84th floor and was working at his desk when the first plane hit. He, much like Ron Clifford, thought it might have been a gas main or something that had exploded in their tower. But then he looked over and saw the damage was next door. He went back into his office to tell his wife and his father that something had happened next door, but that he was fine. When at 9:03 Flight 175 hit, he knew it was terrorism. The 84th floor fell apart around them, with the right wingtip going through his training floor. At this point, he knew he needed to get out. He led a group of coworkers down a few flights of stairs. On the 81st floor landing, a woman stopped them and told them that they had to go up to escape the flames. As the conversation continued, Clark got distracted by the sound of banging and a cry for help from the 81st floor. As he and another coworker, Ron DiFrancesco, went to find the voice, the rest went up and all perished. The voice calling out was Premnath. He guided Clark towards him. At some point during this, DeFrancesco was overcome by smoke and left. Clark moved debris that would allow him to grab Premnath and heave him up over the wall. They both fell back, Premnath gave Clark a kiss, and they introduced themselves to one another. Premnath declared they'd be brothers for life. Both men had a puncture wound on the opposite palm, so Clark pressed their two injured hands together and affirmed that they'd be blood brothers for life. The two made their way back to the 81st floor landing and began to make their way down, where they didn't see any fire at all. Clark's co-worker, DeFrancesco, initially went back up with the others, but then he too made his way down and survived. On the 68th floor, Clark and Premnath met Jose Marrero, Clark's friend. He said he had heard Dave Vieira helping others above, so he was going up too. Clark continued to help Premnath down. Nowadays, Clark calls Marrero his hero. On the 44th floor, they found a security guard staying with a man with bad head and back injuries. He asked Clark and Premnath that when they found the phone, to tell paramedics about the injured man on 44. When they reached the 31st floor, they went in to make a few calls. Prior to the 1993 bombing, Clark's company actually used to be on the 31st. Clark called his wife to let her know he was okay and on his way out. Premnath left a message for his own wife. Then Clark called 911 to tell them about the man on 44 like the security guard asked. In the confusion of that day, he was transferred about 3 times. At 9:53, they finally reached the ground floor, running out of the building. Stanley Premnath, Brian Clark, Ron DeFrancesco, and one other person whose name I just could not find were about the only 4 to escape from the impact zone or just above it in the South Tower. The last story I'm going to tell is of Will Jimeno, who at the time was a rookie assigned to the Port Authority bus terminal. That day, he wanted to stick close to his sergeant, John McLaughlin. His former Navy training told him that he had his best chances sticking close to a leader he respected. He and his small team went into the PAPD substation at the World Trade Center Mall to don their rescue gear. Jimeno recalled seeing a piece of crashed airplane on a reception desk and feeling stunned. It didn't really register properly, even though he knew planes had hit the buildings. His group found a large mall cart to fill with rescue equipment. The group consisted of Sergeant John McLaughlin, Will Jimeno, Dominic Pizzulo, Antonio Rodriguez, and Christopher Amoroso. The team of 5 was in the hallway between the North and South Towers when a massive boom started, followed quickly by an increasingly loud rumbling. Jimeno looked towards the lobby to see a large fireball coming towards them. As they were running, the rush of air from the South Tower's collapse hit them. A piece of concrete hit Jimeno's helmet, knocking it off and sending his radio flying. McLaughlin tried to roll call, but only Jimeno and Pizzulo responded. Rodriguez and Amoroso were presumed dead. Pizzulo was to Jimeno's left amid loose debris. One hallway collapsed onto Jimeno's left side and trapped him face up, with mere inches of space above him. McLaughlin was trapped about 15 feet away in a fetal position. 30 feet above their heads, they could see daylight. Pizzulo managed to shimmy out of his position to get over to Jimeno. He had wanted to get out of the hole and look for help, but McLaughlin wanted him to first get Jimeno out. Once Jimeno was out, the two of them could get McLaughlin out. In the end, Pizzulo decided to follow his sergeant's request to try and get his fellow officer out. During the unsuccessful attempts to get Jimeno out, they discussed what they thought had happened. Not knowing that the South Tower had collapsed, they thought it was possible a car bomb had gone off in the plaza above. Then the North Tower collapsed at 10:28 a.m. Since Jimeno thought he was going to die, he crossed his arms and made the sign language symbol for "I love you" with his hands. This was something he did with his wife and child. He did this now because when or if they found his body, they'd tell his wife, and she'd know in his final moments he was thinking of them. During the collapse, a piece of concrete hit Pizzulo directly in the head. Once the dust settled, Pizzulo, knowing that he was dying, asked McLaughlin for a 3/8, which was code for a break in BAPD. He was granted his 3/8. Jimeno reports his last words being, "Willie, don't forget that I died trying to save you guys." Dominic, I would never let anyone forget that. In his last moments, he took his firearm out of his holster, pointed it up out of the hole above their heads, fired his gun, then slumped over and passed away. For hours, Jimeno and McLaughlin waited for rescue. About 13 hours passed before they were even found. Jimeno was eventually freed around 11 p.m., and McLaughlin was freed the following morning at about 7 a.m. The aftermath of these attacks was immediately apparent. For one, the US was pissed. A lot of people around the world were. Overall, it was considered a strategic error for Al-Qaeda. They did not predict the actions that the US was going to take next. These attacks sparked the war on terror in the Middle East. The US invaded Afghanistan and Iraq to fight against the Taliban and search for the ones responsible. In May of 2011, the main orchestrator of the attacks was killed. In airports, security was tightened significantly. Some people, mainly Republicans, began to associate Muslims and Islam with violence, which personally I find hilarious, considering Christianity's track record. Hundreds of thousands of first responders and workers at Ground Zero have been affected by the toxic air. Now at Ground Zero, there sits a new building dubbed One World Trade Center. In the footprints of the Twin Towers, there are two pools with the names of those who had been murdered on that day and the 1993 bombing. Below the ground is the 9/11 Memorial Museum, where the stories of loss and heroism are told. And now, my thoughts. This was a complicated subject to try and write my thoughts down about, simply because, well, I wasn't alive then. I was still a developing little being in my mom's stomach. I wouldn't be born until over a month later. I have only known the post 9/11 world. I have only known the tight airport security. I have only known the war in the Middle East. I have only known the aftermath. The horrors of that day I have only seen in videos, documentaries, and endless rabbit holes of research. I've tried to wrap my head around why anyone, religiously motivated or not, would want to do this. I know the US has made many questionable decisions in the Middle East, but I can't understand why anyone would even think that flying planes into office buildings would be okay. The people working there were just working, doing their jobs. Moms, dads, sisters, brothers, sons, daughters, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers, and friends. Innocent people murdered because of religious fanaticism and government ineptitude. Can people wonder why my generation is so nihilistic? The stories I told, I wanted to tell because they showed me the best of people and the aftermath of the worst. They are not the full stories. I would be here all day if I did. They are the briefest glimpses of the men and women that survived. I highly recommend looking further into their stories and learning more about the whole event. Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of Disastrophie. If you want, like, comment, share, subscribe, do it if you like. If you want to support me, I've linked my Patreon in the description. There you will get to see the full finished image and incredible incredibly fast time-lapse of the creation process, bloopers, and possibly vote on what comes next. There could also be cute cat videos of my fur baby Koshek. Who knows? My Twitter is also in the description if you'd like to hear my random, usually very incoherent thoughts that I post there. I promise, most episodes do not get this depressing. Anywho, you folks have a wonderful day, and don't do anything that get featured on the news. Don't do it.